You've made it through another day. Well done. Take a slow, deep breath and let your body relax completely. Close your eyes and simply listen to my voice. It's okay if you can't sleep, just rest here with me. Tonight, I'll tell you the story of Sanada Yukimura, the man who chose the losing side and fought so brilliantly that even his enemies called him the greatest warrior in Japan. A man who spent 9 years in quiet exile and then came back, not to save himself, but to stand for something he believed was worth standing for. A man who may have known in some deep part of himself that he could not win and who chose to fight anyway, with everything he had. If you find yourself drifting off while listening, feel free to leave a comment that says, "I made it this far." Right now, somewhere in the world, someone else is listening to this same story, in the same stillness. You are not alone. May you fall asleep tonight, knowing that someone is sharing this quiet night with you. If this time has brought you even a little peace, a subscription would mean the world, only if it truly feels right to you. Now, let the story begin. There is a name in Japanese history that carries a particular weight. Not the weight of power or of great institutions built to last, but the weight of something rarer, the weight of someone who fought not because he thought he could win, but because the fight itself was worth making. His name was Sanada Yukimura, or more precisely, his given name was Nobushige. Yukimura was the name later generations gave him, a name that gathered legend around it like mist gathers in a valley. He was born in 1567 in the mountainous province of Shinano, the land of deep forests and cold rivers that runs down the spine of central Japan. He would die 47 years later, on a spring morning on the outskirts of Osaka, having led one of the most extraordinary last charges in the history of Japanese warfare. Between those two dates lies one of the most remarkable lives of the Sengoku era. The Sanada clan was not one of the great powers of Japan. They controlled a small domain in the mountains of Shinano, the castle town of Ueda, set among steep valley walls and swift rivers. They were not wealthy. They did not command vast armies. They had no ancient prestige that gave their words special weight. What they had was cleverness and stubbornness, and a willingness to take risks that larger lords with more to lose could not afford to take. Yukimura's father, Sanada Masayuki, was perhaps the most cunning military strategist of his generation. Not the most powerful, not the most famous during his own lifetime, but the kind of man who could look at a situation that seemed impossible and find the one angle of approach no one else had considered. The Sanada were surrounded by greater powers, the Oda, the Takeda, the Tokugawa, the Uesugi. They navigated between these giants the way a small boat navigates between large ships, carefully, watching the wakes, using the currents that others created. It was into this family, this tradition of precise, patient intelligence, that Yukimura was born. Masayuki, Yukimura's father, had served the great Takeda Shingen. When Shingen died, and the Takeda clan eventually collapsed, Masayuki was left without a patron. He was a lord without an overlord, in a world where that was a very dangerous condition. He did what the Sanada had always done. He adapted. He looked at the changing landscape and made calculations that no one else had made. He built Ueda Castle in 1583, a relatively modest fortification, but one positioned with extraordinary strategic intelligence. Sitting above the Ueda Basin, guarding the roads between east and west, it was a fortress designed not to dominate, but to resist. There is a difference between those two things. Domination requires resources, resistance requires only cleverness, determination, and the right piece of ground. Masayuki had chosen his ground very well, and his sons, Yukimura and his older brother Nobuyuki, grew up watching him make these calculations, watching him read the room, watching him survive, year after year, in a world that killed lords who made a single wrong move. The era Yukimura was born into had a name: Sengoku, the Warring States period, a time when the central authority of Japan had fractured, and lords across the country fought for land, survival, and the chance to be the one who put the country back together. It was 100 years of almost continuous war. Armies marching, castles burning, alliances made and broken and remade again, sometimes in the course of a single year. For a boy growing up in this world, war was not a distant abstraction. It was the background condition of existence, the thing that shaped every calculation, every alliance, every marriage. Yukimura trained in arms from childhood. He learned to ride. He learned to read terrain and weather. He learned to think about movement, not just his own movement, but the movement of armies, of power, of opportunity. He was his father's son. He absorbed the lessons that the Sanada survival required. But there was something in Yukimura that went beyond his father's cool practicality, something that, in later years, would look less like calculation and more like conviction. The first great test came in 1585. Tokugawa Ieyasu, already the lord of a substantial eastern domain, already a man of considerable power, sent an army west to subdue the Sanada. He sent 8,000 men. Masayuki had perhaps 2,000. The odds were impossible. Any sensible lord would have submitted. The Sanada did not. Masayuki closed the gates of Ueda Castle. He positioned his men in the towers and along the walls. He sent out small units to harass the approaching army. Probing attacks, hit-and-run raids, the tactics of a man who wants the enemy moving and uncertain, rather than settled and confident. The Tokugawa army arrived at Ueda. They outnumbered the defenders by 4-1. They attacked, and they were repulsed. The defenders at Ueda used every feature of the terrain, the river, the narrow valley, the sightlines from the castle towers. They did not fight the battle the Tokugawa wanted to fight. They fought the battle they had chosen. The Tokugawa army withdrew. A larger force had been driven back from the gates of a smaller castle by a smaller garrison. The name Sanada began to mean something it had not quite meant before. The young Yukimura watched all of this. He was 18 years old during the first battle of Ueda, old enough to fight, old enough to begin to understand what his father had understood, that in war, position and timing and deception could overcome the raw arithmetic of numbers. The lesson was not that courage conquers all. Courage alone is not enough. The lesson was more subtle and more lasting, that a defender who understands his ground, who dictates the terms of engagement, who makes the attacker fight the wrong battle, such a defender can hold against forces that would otherwise overwhelm him. Yukimura would carry this lesson for the rest of his life. He would use it at Osaka 30 years later, in a way that would stun even the greatest commanders of his age. But that was still far away. For now, he was a young man watching his father celebrate a victory that should have been impossible. The celebration was quiet. Masayuki was not a man for ceremony. He looked at what had happened, noted what had worked, and began thinking about what came next. The decades that followed were decades of navigation. Japan was changing. The long chaos of the Sengoku period was being slowly forced into order. First by Oda Nobunaga, who killed or subdued the lords who would not submit. Then by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who charmed and outmaneuvered the rest into a rough unity. The Sanada navigated through all of it. They made alliances. They adjusted their positions as the larger powers shifted. Masayuki maintained relationships with multiple factions simultaneously. The Uesugi to the north, the Tokugawa to the east, the Toyotomi in the west. It was a delicate balance, the kind that requires constant attention and rapid adjustment. Yukimura grew to manhood in this environment. He served as a hostage in various courts, first with the Uesugi, then under Hideyoshi himself, in Osaka. Being a hostage was, in this era, not simply confinement. It was education. You lived in the court of a powerful lord. You watched how he governed. You absorbed the culture and the military thinking and the political habits of a great house. Yukimura learned from Hideyoshi's court. He learned what large-scale organization looked like. He learned what Osaka Castle was. not just as a physical structure, but as a symbol, as a center of power, as a thing that meant something to the people who built it. He did not know, then, that he would one day return to defend it. Hideyoshi died in 1598. His son, Hideyori, was 5 years old, too young to rule, too important to ignore. The Council of Five Regents was supposed to hold Japan stable until Hideyori came of age. Tokugawa Ieyasu was one of those regents. Everyone who understood the situation knew what was coming. Ieyasu was the most powerful lord in Japan. He had waited with extraordinary patience for 30 years. He was not going to step back now. The country divided, west against east, Toyotomi loyalists against the Tokugawa. The Sanada, as always, had to choose. Masayuki chose Ishida Mitsunari and the Western cause. His older son Nobuyuki chose Ieyasu and the East. The family split. Deliberately, some historians believe, to ensure that whichever side won, the Sanada would survive. Yukimura chose to stay with his father, with the West, with the cause that would, within a few years, be defeated at Sekigahara. Whether he knew this, we cannot say. In the autumn of 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu was moving his main army west towards Sekigahara. His son Hidetada was supposed to bring a second large army down through the mountains, through Shinano province, past Ueda Castle. Masayuki saw his opportunity. He offered to submit to Hidetada. He sent diplomats. He negotiated. He drew out the process with extraordinary skill. And while he negotiated, he prepared the castle. When Hidetada finally lost patience and attacked, the Sanada were ready. What followed was a near repeat of 1585. Hidetada's army, 38,000 men, hammered at the walls of Ueda. The defenders held. For several days, the much larger force could not break through. When news came that the main battle at Sekigahara was imminent, Hidetada was forced to abandon the siege and march west. He arrived too late for the battle. Ieyasu had already won. His son's failure to reach the battle in time was, by some accounts, one of the things that angered Ieyasu most in the aftermath of Sekigahara. 2,000 men had held 38,000 for long enough to matter. Sekigahara was decided on a single October morning in 1600. The Western Army lost. Ishida Mitsunari was captured and executed. The lords who had fought for the Toyotomi cause were stripped of their lands. Masayuki and Yukimura had no army left to resist. They surrendered. Ieyasu considered executing them. By the rights of the age, he had every cause to do so. But Nobuyuki, the older Sanada brother who had fought for Ieyasu, pleaded for their lives, and a senior Tokugawa official interceded on their behalf. The sentence was commuted. Not freedom, not forgiveness, exile. They were to be sent to the monastery complex on Mount Koya, Koyasan, the great Buddhist mountain south of Osaka. They gathered what they needed. They said their goodbyes, and they began the long walk up into the mountains. Mount Koya rises above the surrounding forest like an island above a sea of trees. The road to it is steep and winding, cutting through cryptomeria forests, where the light filters green and cold, even in summer. The higher you climb, the quieter it becomes. The sounds of the valley fall away. The air changes. At the top, within a bowl in the mountains, the great monasteries of the Shingon Buddhist sect have stood for more than 1,000 years. This is where Masayuki and Yukimura were sent. Not to a comfortable prison, not to a house arrest in a familiar city. To the mountain, to the silence, to a life stripped of political meaning. They settled in a small residence at the base of the mountain complex, in a place called Kudoyama. It was modest. It was cold in winter. It was very far from everything they had known. Masayuki was already in his mid-50s. For a man who had spent his entire life in motion, in calculation, and the constant management of danger, this stillness was, perhaps, its own kind of death. The years at Kudoyama are quiet in the historical record. We know they happened. We have a few letters, from Yukimura to his brother Nobuyuki, to various lords asking for money for rice, for clothing, for the basic necessities that their reduced circumstances no longer provided naturally. The letters are careful and polite. They reveal very little of what he felt, but between the lines you can read the texture of the life, the slowness of it, the distance from events, the way the world moved on without them. In Edo, the Tokugawa shogunate was consolidating. Ieyasu was appointed shogun. He passed the title to his son Hidetada. The institutions of Tokugawa power were being built, piece by piece, into something designed to last forever. In Kudoyama, Yukimura read about these things. He watched the seasons change. He raised his children, the children who had been allowed to accompany him into exile. He maintained his skills as best he could. He waited. He was not certain what he was waiting for, but the waiting was itself a kind of answer. Masayuki died in exile in 1611. He was 65 years old. He had spent the last 11 years of his life on the mountain, stripped of the arena in which he had been most alive. By some accounts, he died in despair. By others, with the equanimity of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by any ending. The historical record does not tell us which is true. Yukimura buried his father. He continued his quiet life at Kudayama. 3 more years passed, and then the letter came. In 1614, Toyotomi Hideyori, now a young man of 21 living in Osaka Castle with his mother Yodo Dono, sent out word. He was assembling men. He was calling back the Ronin, the masterless samurai, who had been scattered after Sekigahara. He was preparing to resist the Tokugawa. Would Sanada Yukimura come? The decision Yukimura faced was not simple. He was 46 years old. He had lived in quiet exile for 14 years. He had children who depended on him. He had, if not a comfortable life, at least a safe one. Going to Osaka meant choosing the Toyotomi side. It meant opposing Ieyasu, who was now effectively the ruler of all Japan. It meant reopening a conflict that had been settled in blood and surrender 14 years earlier. It meant, in all probability, fighting a war that could not be won. The Tokugawa were stronger than they had ever been. Ieyasu had spent 14 years building exactly the kind of institutional permanence that was very hard to dismantle. Hideyori had the symbolic power of his father's legacy, but symbols alone do not win battles. A practical man would have stayed on the mountain. Yukimura went down. Why? The question has occupied historians for 4 centuries. The most honest answer may be the simplest one. Because the Toyotomi cause was the cause he had chosen. Because his father had chosen it. Because in some deep part of himself, Yukimura believed that a commitment made was a commitment worth keeping, even when keeping it was costly. Even when the arithmetic said it could not succeed. He descended from Kudoyama in the winter of 1614. The mountain fell away behind him. The world he had left 14 years earlier came up to meet him. Louder, more complicated, more dangerous than the quiet life on the mountain had been. He traveled west, to Osaka, to the castle that Hideyoshi had built at the center of Japan's power. The castle he had first seen as a young man, when he had been a hostage in Hideyoshi's court. The castle that had represented for that entire generation the apex of what the Toyotomi had built. He rode through the castle gates. He was home in a way he had not been home in a very long time. Not because the castle was his, but because the cause it represented was something he recognized, something he had carried with him on the mountain all those years. Hideyori received him, the young Toyotomi lord, serious, intelligent, carrying the weight of a legacy he had not chosen, looked at the older warrior who had come down from exile to fight for him. We do not have a record of what was said between them, but Yukimura stayed, and he began to work. Osaka Castle, in 1614, was the greatest fortress in Japan. Hideyoshi had spent years and enormous resources building it. The central keep rose above the city like a mountain. The stone walls were massive, some of the stones so large it is still a mystery how they were moved. The moats were wide and deep. The ground plan was labyrinthine, designed to confuse and trap an attacker. Inside the castle, the forces were assembling. Men who had been scattered after Sekigahara came in from all over Japan. Ronin who had been drifting without purpose since their lords had fallen. Soldiers who had never accepted the Tokugawa settlement. Idealists, opportunists, men with nothing left to lose. At the peak of the assembly, Osaka Castle held perhaps 90,000 men. But 90,000 men, however brave, are only as effective as their organization and leadership. And the Osaka side had a problem. Many of its commanders had strong opinions and no agreed-upon strategy. There was bravery in abundance. There was coordination that was harder to come by. This was the situation Yukimura entered. He saw it clearly, and he began to do what he could do. He chose his ground. To the south of Osaka Castle, outside the castle walls, there was a low rise in the terrain. In military terms, it was a liability, an approach that a besieging army could use to threaten the castle walls from relatively close range. Yukimura looked at it differently. He proposed building a fortification there, not as part of the castle itself, but as a separate position that could project force outward and draw the enemy's attention away from the main walls. The Sanada Maru. It was built in weeks, a roughly semicircular earthwork fortification with stakes and ditches on its outer face, connected to the castle wall behind it by a narrow covered corridor. It was not large, but it was positioned with characteristic Sanada precision. Any army approaching from the south would have to deal with it before they could reach the castle. It was a forward position from which defenders could pour fire onto attackers who advanced past it, and it was built in such a way that attacking it from the front was extremely costly. The Tokugawa commanders, when they saw it, understood immediately what it meant. The Tokugawa army that arrived at Osaka in November of 1614 was enormous. 200,000 men, by some accounts. Perhaps less, but vastly more than the defenders had. They surrounded the city. They positioned their artillery. They prepared for a siege. Ieyasu himself was present. He had come in person, at 71 years old, to oversee the destruction of the last obstacle to permanent Tokugawa dominance. He looked at the Sanada Maru. He ordered his southern forces to take it. The attacks came in waves, and they were stopped. The Sanada Maru held. The defenders inside, Yukimura's men among others, used their position with lethal efficiency. Every angle of approach had been thought through. Every line of fire had been considered. The attackers came across open ground and were met with concentrated resistance from a position that had been designed specifically to make their approach as costly as possible. The ground in front of the Sanada Maru was covered in dead. The Tokugawa commanders pulled back. The siege settled into a pattern. Artillery bombardment, probing attacks, the slow war of attrition that a larger force uses against a smaller one. Ieyasu's guns fired into the castle. The noise was enormous. The psychological pressure was constant. Within the castle, the defenders held, but the strain was visible. Food could still get through. The siege was not yet complete, but the castle's garrison knew, with mathematical certainty, that Osaka's resources were finite. The weeks passed. November became December. December became January. The winter at Osaka was cold and wet. Men in both armies, the besiegers and the besieged, huddled around fires at night and thought about their families, about the homes they had left, about whether any of this would end in a way that allowed them to go back. Most of them had not chosen this war. They had followed lords who had chosen it. They were doing what men in this world did, going where they were sent, fighting for causes they had been assigned, enduring what endurance required. In the Sanada Maru, Yukimura kept watch. Peace negotiations began in late December. Neither side had achieved what it wanted. Ieyasu had not broken through the castle's defenses. The defenders had not broken the siege. Terms were discussed. An agreement was eventually reached. The castle would not be taken by force. Hideyori would remain. The armies would stand down. As part of the agreement, or as the Osaka side later claimed, through deliberate deception, Tokugawa workers began filling the outer moat. The defenders protested. The Tokugawa representatives said it was a misunderstanding. The filling continued. By the time the argument was resolved, the outer moat was gone. The Sanada Maru, the position that it held against everything the Tokugawa could throw at it, now stood exposed, without the moat that had protected its approaches. Osaka Castle, stripped of its outer layer of defense, stood more vulnerable than it had before the siege. The winter siege was over. The summer siege was already being prepared. Spring came to Osaka slowly. The plum blossoms appeared first, small white flowers on bare branches, the first color after the long gray winter. Then the cherry blossoms, in their brief and overwhelming abundance. Pink clouds along the river, petals falling like slow snow. In the castle, the defenders watched the seasons change and prepared. They knew the summer would bring the Tokugawa back. They knew the army would be even larger. They knew the outer moat, their best defense, was gone. Negotiations between Osaka and Edo failed. Whatever terms might have preserved Hideyori's position could not be agreed upon. Or, as some historians argue, Ieyasu did not want to agree. He wanted the final solution. He wanted the Toyotomi question settled permanently. The armies began to move again in May of 1615. Yukimura gathered his men. He looked out at the spring city of Osaka, the river, the castle, the hills beyond, and he prepared himself. He was 47 years old. He had spent his whole life preparing for something like this. The strategic situation for the Osaka defenders was now fundamentally different from the winter. In winter, they had been able to shelter behind formidable walls and let the attackers wear themselves out against prepared positions. In summer, with the outer moat gone, the castle was far more vulnerable to direct assault. Several of Osaka's commanders argued for staying inside and fighting defensively. Yukimura argued for a different approach. He proposed that the Osaka forces take the fight outside the walls, meet the Tokugawa army in the open field, deny them the chance to conduct a methodical siege, and give the defenders courage and fighting ability, the space to matter. His argument was this: inside the castle, numbers would eventually tell. In the field, a decisive blow might change everything. The plan that emerged was a combination, some forces holding the castle, others fighting in the open. Yukimura would lead his troops in the open field. He chose his position carefully, to the south of the castle, near the village of Tennoji. The night before the Battle of Tennoji was warm. It was late May. The plum rains had not yet come. The air was soft and heavy, full of the smell of rice fields newly flooded for the season. The two armies lay across from each other on the plains south of Osaka. Fires burned in both camps, the sound of equipment being checked and rechecked. Metal on metal, leather adjusted, sandals tightened. The low voices of men who might be dead by morning, talking about whatever men talk about when they know this. Yukimura, it is said, was calm. He had prepared everything he could prepare. He had positioned his men as well as the ground allowed. He had thought through the attack he intended to make, considered the angles, imagined the movements. Now there was nothing to do but rest. Whether he slept, we do not know. He had been a warrior his entire life. He knew that the body needed what it needed. Perhaps he closed his eyes. Perhaps he watched the stars move slowly across the sky above Osaka. The world was very quiet before it became very loud. Dawn came on June 3rd, 1615. The armies formed. The banners were raised. The drums began. Yukimura's forces were positioned in the center-south of the Osaka line. His red armor, the deep crimson that the Sanada forces wore in battle, was visible across the field. Red was the Sanada color, the crimson of autumn leaves, of burning embers. When you saw that red in the field, you knew what it meant. The battle began with the usual exchange of missile fire, arrows, then guns, smoke drifting across the morning air. Then the lines crashed together. The fighting was close and brutal. The sounds of close combat are nothing like the sounds of distant weapons. They are immediate, personal, the sounds of effort and collision and consequence. Yukimura moved through it. He was not a young man, 47, in armor, in the summer heat, but the accounts describe him as apparently indefatigable, moving, encouraging, directing, fighting. He had a plan, and he began to execute it. The plan was audacious. Yukimura's forces were outnumbered. The Tokugawa army was enormous. A straightforward clash would favor the larger force. So Yukimura did not fight a straightforward battle. He led his men in a driving thrust, not along the entire front, but concentrated, focused, aimed at a specific target, the headquarters of Tokugawa Ieyasu. If you could reach the commander desperate and create the chaos of a direct threat to the man who held the entire Eastern army together, the battle might break in ways that numbers could not predict. It was a gamble. The kind of gamble that only a man with nothing to lose could make. The kind that requires absolute commitment, no holding back, no hedging, no preparing for retreat. Yukimura's forces cut through the Tokugawa lines. They drove forward, through the screens of defensive troops, through the bodies of men who tried to stop them, toward the headquarters camp. The accounts of what happened next vary in their details, but the core event, recorded in multiple sources, including Tokugawa accounts that had no reason to exaggerate, is this. Yukimura's forces broke through the outer defenses of Ieyasu's headquarters. They reached the camp. Ieyasu, 72 years old, the most powerful man in Japan, the man who had outweighted and outmaneuvered every opponent for a lifetime, prepared to flee. He reportedly told his men he was going to fight to the death. His guards reportedly prevented him. He moved his command position back. One account says he moved back not once but 3 times as the red-armored Sanada forces pushed toward him. Another says that he lost control of his composure entirely, a detail that was recorded because it tells you something about the intensity of the moment. Whatever the truth of these details, the unmistakable fact is that Yukimura came closer to killing Tokugawa Ieyasu than anyone had in Ieyasu's lifetime. From a position of overwhelming disadvantage, a single concentrated breakthrough had nearly changed the course of history. But nearly is not enough. The Osaka forces elsewhere on the field were struggling. The coordination that a winning army needs, the ability to exploit pressure when it is created, was not there. The breakthrough toward Ieyasu's camp could not be reinforced. Yukimura's men had come incredibly far. They had done what may have been the maximum that human effort and tactical brilliance could do. But the weight of the Tokugawa army was too great. The larger force found its stability. The lines that had bent began to push back. Yukimura's men, exhausted from the effort of the charge, fighting in the heat of a late spring day, were pressed from multiple sides. He himself was wounded. The accounts describe him resting briefly at a small shrine on the edge of the battlefield, seated on a camp stool, breathing hard. A Tokugawa samurai found him there. The samurai hesitated, knowing who this was, knowing what he was seeing. Yukimura looked at him and spoke. "I am Sanada Shimosa Kami Nobushige. Kill me." The battle did not end immediately when Yukimura fell. The fighting continued through the morning and into the afternoon. The Osaka forces were pushed back. The castle was breached. Fire broke out. The towers of Osaka Castle, the great central keep that Hideyoshi had built as the symbol of Toyotomi power, burned. Hideyori and his mother Yododono died in the fire. Whether by their own hand or overtaken by the flames, the sources differ. The Toyotomi line ended. The war that had begun when Hideyoshi died was finally, decisively, permanently over. Ieyasu had won. The peace that would last 260 years had been secured, and Yukimura was dead on the southern plain of Osaka, having failed to achieve the thing he had set out to do. In the days after the battle, the Tokugawa commanders who had fought against Yukimura spoke of him. They had encountered many warriors. They had fought in many battles. But what they had seen on the plain at Tennoji, the charge through the lines, the push toward Ieyasu's headquarters, the burning red armor moving through the smoke, had affected them in a way they struggled to articulate. A senior Tokugawa general put it simply. He called Yukimura the #1 warrior in Japan, Nihon Ichi no Tsuamono, the greatest warrior in Japan. These words, spoken by the men who had defeated him, became the way the world remembered him. Not as a winner, not as a man who achieved his goal, as a man who, in the act of losing, had demonstrated something about human possibility that winners rarely show so clearly. What is it that made Yukimura's story different from simple defeat? History is full of people who lost battles. Most of them are forgotten. Yukimura was not forgotten. His story has been told in Japan continuously for 400 years. It appears in novels, plays, television dramas, video games. His red armor is one of the most recognizable images in Japanese historical culture. Why? Perhaps because his story touches something that ordinary victory stories do not reach. There is a word in Japanese aesthetics, mono no aware, the poignancy of things, the beauty that comes from transience, from knowing that the cherry blossoms will fall, that the summer will end, that all things pass. Yukimura's story is suffused with mono no aware. He came back from the mountain when he did not have to. He chose the losing side with his eyes open. He built the Sanada Maru with skill and love, knowing it might not be enough. He led his charge at Tennoji, knowing the odds. And in all of this, in the knowing and the doing anyway, there was something that resonated across centuries. The aesthetics of Japanese military culture have always had a complicated relationship with defeat. In the samurai tradition, how you face the end, whether you meet it with clarity and courage, matters as much as whether you win. This is not mere romanticism, it is in part a practical recognition of reality. In a world where battles are decided by factors beyond any individual's control, the timing of allies, the weather, the chance betrayal, the one thing a warrior can control completely is himself, his bearing, his choices, the quality of his attention. Yukimura controlled what he could control. He chose his ground at the Sanada Maru with extraordinary care. He directed his men with intelligence and commitment. He led his final charge with everything he had, reaching further than anyone thought possible. And when it was over, he sat at the shrine and waited with dignity for what came next. This is the tradition he embodied, not because he chose death over life, but because he chose completeness over safety. There is something worth sitting with in the quiet of this night. Yukimura did not win. The cause he served was lost. The castle he defended burned. And yet the men who defeated him called him the greatest warrior in Japan. What does that mean? It means perhaps that there are kinds of excellence that success does not require. That a man can do something that is fully, completely, extraordinarily what it was, and still not achieve the outcome he was aiming for. The charge at Tennoji was not diminished by its failure to kill Ieyasu. It was what it was, completely, a moment of human effort so concentrated and committed that it reached the edge of the impossible. This is a harder thing to hold on to than simple success stories. It requires a different understanding of what matters, but it may be a truer understanding, because most of us, in our lives, will not get to choose whether we succeed or fail. We will only get to choose how completely we show up for the things we care about. Ueda Castle still stands in the mountains of Nagano Prefecture, the old Shinano province. The castle that Masayuki built and defended sits above the city of Ueda. The stone walls are weathered. The main keep was rebuilt in the Edo period, but the site is recognizably the same. The river runs below the valley walls. In spring, cherry trees bloom along the river and along the castle approach. Tourists come to stand on the ground where a small garrison twice held off vastly larger armies, where Yukimura grew up watching his father practice the art of intelligent resistance. The place is quiet, ordinary in the way that historically significant places often are. You have to fill in the rest yourself. You have to bring the knowledge of what happened here and overlay it on the trees and the stone and the smell of the mountain air. When you do that, when you stand on ground where something extraordinary happened and try to feel the weight of it, you are doing something the Japanese call sui taiken, following experience, letting the past become, for a moment, present. The Sanada Maru is gone. The earthwork fortification that Yukimura built in the weeks before the winter siege, the position that held against everything the Tokugawa could throw at it, did not survive the wars and the centuries. But the place where it stood still exists. In the Tennoji neighborhood of present-day Osaka, there is a small park and a shrine. A statue of Yukimura stands there, full armor, sword raised, looking south toward where the Tokugawa army would have come. People leave flowers. School groups come for field trips. On the anniversary of the battle, there are ceremonies. 400 years of aftermath, and people are still coming to the place where he stood. This is what enduring reputation looks like. Not a monument built by the winners, but a consistent return by ordinary people who find something in the story that matters to them, something they want to stand near. Nikko, where Ieyasu is enshrined, is magnificent, gold and lacquer and centuries of accumulated reverence. The tomb of Yukimura is simpler. There is a grave marker at a temple in Osaka, Sankoji Temple. Simple stone, the characters of his name. Near Kudoyama, where he spent his years of exile, there are memorials. The town has embraced the connection. There are museums, monuments, local crafts associated with his name. The contrast is instructive. Ieyasu built his own memory deliberately. The great shrine, the deification, the institutional permanence. He controlled his story from the beginning. Yukimura's memory was built by others, by the people who told his story to their children, who made plays and novels and eventually television dramas and video games about a man whose cause was lost and whose brilliance was remembered anyway. The winner built his monument. The loser's monument built itself. It is very late now. The city is quiet. The sounds of the day have settled. What remains is the sound of your own breathing and the far-off sound of the world continuing its work without you. This is the state that Yukimura knew well, the stillness before action, the gathering quiet. He knew it on the mountain at Koya. He knew it in the castle at Osaka, waiting for the Tokugawa artillery to begin. He knew it at Tennoji, on the night before the final battle. In each of those places, the stillness was not emptiness, it was fullness, of preparation, of attention, of whatever the deepest part of a person is that continues to orient toward what matters, even when the outcome is uncertain. You have been carrying today since it began. You've held all of it, the things that went right, the things that didn't, the small negotiations and small victories and small defeats that make up the texture of a human day. The cherry blossoms at Osaka fall in April. They fall whether anyone is watching or not. They fall whether the year has been peaceful or violent, whether the city is at war or at rest. The Japanese have watched them fall for 1,000 years and made a philosophy from the watching. Beauty and transience are not opposites. The falling is part of the beauty. The knowing that it will end is what makes the attention so full. Yukimura understood this. He must have. A man who chooses to come down from the mountain and fight a battle he cannot win. He has made his peace with the falling. He has decided that the blossoms are worth more fully seen than preserved by not seeing them at all. This is the world he lived in, a world where the forms of things mattered deeply, and where the form of a warrior's last effort could outlast the effort's outcome by 400 years. The cherry blossoms at Osaka fall. They have always fallen. They will fall next spring, and the spring after that. And somewhere in that falling is the shape of Yukimura's story. Let your eyes close, if they haven't already. Your body is heavier than it was when we began. The thoughts that seemed so sharp an hour ago have softened. This is the natural movement of the night. Everything coming slowly to rest. Yukimura spent years learning to rest when resting was required. On the mountain at Koya, in the years of exile, he did not fight the stillness. He inhabited it. He let it teach him what stillness teaches. That rest is not the absence of effort. It is the preparation for effort. That the body and the mind that rests well is the body and the mind that can act fully when action is required. Your action today is done. You have done what today required. Tomorrow will bring what it brings. You will meet it. But not yet. Not now. Now is for the darkness and the quiet and the breathing. The Tokugawa peace lasted 260 years. Within that long peace, the story of Sanada Yukimura was told and retold. Plays were written. Stories were passed down. The red armor became an image that every child in Japan knew. It is one of history's stranger outcomes, that within the peace created by the man Yukimura tried to stop, Yukimura's own story became beloved. Perhaps because the Tokugawa peace, for all its genuine achievements, was also a piece of strict hierarchies and enforced conformity. And in that world, the story of a man who refused to accept the winning side, who came back from the mountain to fight for something he believed in, was a story that people needed. Not as a model for imitation. Most people cannot and do not choose the beautiful gesture over safety, but as a reminder that such a choice is possible, that someone once made it, and that 400 years later, people still come to the place where he stood and leave flowers at his grave. The night is very deep now. Somewhere a river is moving through a mountain valley. The cryptomeria trees on Mount Koya are dark and still. The castle town of Ueda is asleep under its winter mountains. And on the southern plain of Osaka, in the ordinary city that exists now where the army stood, the night is quiet. The ground does not remember. Grounds don't. Only people remember. And the remembering keeps something alive that would otherwise be lost. Not just the story of one man, but the possibility that such a story represents. The possibility of showing up fully, of doing what you believe is worth doing. Not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because the doing is itself the thing. Sleep now. You have traveled far enough for one night. The morning will come, as it always does, and whatever it brings, you will face it. But not yet, not yet. Let the darkness hold you. Let the river move in the valley. Let the mountain be still.